Hello and welcome back to another video. Today I'm doing the 25.9 top plane tier list server content. Like, subscribe, and let's get into it. There were a couple of changes this patch, most notably around the systems. The likes of Biscuits and Ignite got adjusted. We also saw a nerf towards Roa, the removal of first scrubs, and we also saw direct buffs towards the likes of Shen, Cassante, nerfs to Gwen. Neferi got nerfed, but I've removed her from the top lane tier list as once again her pick rate has pretty heavily declined. She's still viable here, but just not as popular. And yeah, let's get into it. So the D tier is going to consist of the same champions. We lead off with Udyr, Smolder, and Maokai. In the case of Udyr, he's in a pretty dire spot for top lane at the moment. Both combined nerfs of him and his items have just left him in a state where he struggles to really compete against many of the other options. He can still do a lot of damage, but once you get access to those first items, you can definitely struggle compared to where you were in previous seasons. The likes of Unending Despair and Fimbulwinter are substantially weaker items. In the case of Smolder, I'd recommend only ever picking him into a tank, primarily as a counter pick, and utilizing the fact that you can kind of freely scale and snowball within the, well, not even snowball, just freely scale and CS through within the lane to kind of scale up and be a useful champion later on. It's not a consistent way of climbing, and I think he's very, very conditional. Maybe like Cassante blind is the only place where I'd really recommend playing him. Otherwise, there are just better options to go to at the moment. In the case of Maokai, his pick rate has pretty heavily declined once again in the top lane. It was sad because he was beginning to really see a real pickup in the last season as a top lane option. I believe he was really adopted quite a bit within Korea as well, but now he's just gone back to being pretty bad as an option. He doesn't really have the damage to ever pose an individual threat. He needs to scale, and his items just aren't good enough to really support him as a champion at the moment in the top lane. He's still a good jungler and a good support. Good jungler for competitive, not for solo queue. A good support in solo queue, little more niche in competitive, but Maokai top definitely one of the roles he's struggling in more. In the case of Nidalee, she should probably be in the D tier. I think she's an incredibly hard champion to play, and you are incredibly predicated on getting early game advantages. That being said, though, I think if you play it well, it's genuinely not that bad of a pick. I think it can have its place and can definitely work, but you do just have to pilot the pick extraordinarily well, and if you can't, then I'd recommend just looking towards other things. It's not worth going down this rabbit hole. Other picks within the C tier, leading off are Malzahar. Malzahar top still has an audience. It's alright. You can play him as like a flex option from mid to top, or if he's just a champion you really enjoy playing him in the top lane can work. I don't think he's one of the best options, but he's got a place here, and he can definitely function. In the case of Tahm Kench, she's just suffered from nerf after nerf, and then items got weaker for him. He's in a pretty rough spot for top lane at the moment. This is the elo he does best in. You could honestly consider him a high C tier pick, if anything. If you can get him in spots where you know you're going to be able to play on your AD carry, and you can get value through his ultimate through that means, then I think there are some levels of spots where you can play this champion, but I just don't think he's that great at the moment. He's just been over nerfed. In the case of Jace and Rumble and Gangplank, these champions are all just very hard to play, and I mean, if you can play them, then they can be good options to climb with. In fact, I believe out of the top 10 top laners on EU West, almost I think there's 8 or 9 of them play Jace within their top 3 most played champions. This champion clearly does very well in Elite, and it's definitely a pick I recommend at least trying. And once you get comfortable with it, then yeah, you can bring it into solo queue, and you should be able to get good results. I think he's got a variety of things he can do now. Previously, Jace was very linear, and he would just play Phase Rush with Assassin, but now you can opt into Grasp, you can go kind of bruisery, and this pick can still work very well. In the case of, the other two, Rumble and Cassante and Gangplank, they're all pretty hard champions to master. Cassante got buffed this patch, and it pushes him back towards the high end of the C tier. I think this champion, he needed the buff. He's definitely weak compared to where he should be, being a competitively skewed champion, and we're not even really seeing competitive play. I think, however, the main problem is the fact that his kit is early game skewed. I would like to see them skew his kit once again towards being more late game, so he can be a bit better for solo queue without dominating competitive. In the case of Rumble, he's a hard champion to play. He's very unique in the way his heat mechanic works, and if you can understand the balancing act of like trying to maintain it, trying to really pressure out someone in lane, then he can be a good option. But once again, not a champion I recommend unless you're very, very comfortable playing him. Gangplank, unless you're solo backer, this champion tends to underperform for the most part. It's always been the common meme of the pick. But on a more serious note, I don't think this pick is terrible. I just think he's very hard to play, and if you're not willing to put the time into him, it's just best looking elsewhere. Some of the other picks within the C tier include the likes of Swain, who's a pretty niche counter pick. I think in the right spot, he's a fine option. He's never going to be one of the best go-to top lane picks, but considering he's like a four-way flex pick and he can be played into like pretty heavy melee tanky compositions, I think he does have a spot which he can definitely function in here. In the case of Karma, she got nerfed pretty heavily, in fact to the point where I'm actually not going to I'll re-add her for one more, but Karma's pick rate has massively declined. She really doesn't see play in top at the moment. That 10 flat Q damage nerf really hurt both her solo lanes from a spot where she was doing pretty decently in as well, which is kind of unfortunate to see. That being said, Karma tends to be a real big frustration point within top lane, so most people will be happy about that, and yeah, the pick is just underperforming at the moment. In the case of Alawi, she's a pretty low elo skewed underperforming pick. This champion probably needs some sort of rework. She is increasingly unpopular as the patches go by, and she just isn't that performant at the moment, yet maintains a level of ban rate and is a big frustration point within the top lane. Dropping down from the A tier to the B tier is Gwen. This champion probably sits between B and C at the moment. The lower down you go, the harder this champion is to make work. She is a very elite skewed pick, mostly from the fact that you have to be able to utilize her early like strengths to translate into late game power, and yeah, the lower down you go, the less likely that is going to happen, and I would just not really recommend her for that reason. That being said though, she's still decent, like she's still a fine pick, and especially if you've put the time into her and you're comfortable playing her all the way up into elite, then I think this pick can still definitely be considered an A, maybe even S tier pick in the right hands. Other picks within the B tier, things like Yone are worth, I would say are worth watching at the moment. Yone is not that performant in the top lane in his current state. Ever since they did the W nerf, his champion's definitely been struggling a bit. That was a decent chunk of chip damage to lose. That being said though, the later on into the game you go, the more that the other changes would matter. The Q, no, just like the crit modifier changes will come into play as you get like your second, third item online. And I still think, yeah, that can be really valuable. This champion is definitely weaker though, sits as more like a low B tier option, and if you're not comfortable with him, I wouldn't really be playing him at the moment. Silas is performing quite well, actually probably sits towards the high end of the B tier. This pick has adopted a grasp and rower setup within the top lane. That being said, rower did get nerfed this patch, but there are other options which we have seen like the Silas players opt into. I don't think it's cut and dry going rower. That being said though, the option to go grasp and then heavily trade in certain matchups and then get that sustain, get the extra HP is very nice on him, and I do definitely think this pick is deserving of a high B tier, a high to mid B tier spot at the moment. You still primarily want to use him as a counter pick. I would never really recommend blinding Silas. There are a lot of top laners which can heavily punish him. Aurora just isn't that popular or that performant in the top lane at the moment. I still think this option's good, especially in elite, but that's mostly where you're going to be playing her as like an elite AP option. For average play, she just isn't doing that well at the moment. Case of Ambessa, she's a very high skill AD bruiser with the option to go an assassin build. I think this pick is still in a very good spot for elite and competitive. For average play, also has the issue of just being a very hard to play master champion, and you need to put a lot of time into her to really get the most out of the pick. Gragas is alright. I think the row enough is going to affect him if you do opt into that, but we've seen other options, things like just Arcane Jewels on its own into like Cosmic Drive is a pretty performant way of playing Gragas, and I still think this champion can get good value in the right compositions. He's just not the same, like, really dominant OP pick, which he has been in the past. He's more balanced in his current state. Definitely a lot weaker early as well, with the substantial nerfs to his passive, which he has received over time. Yasuo, I think, is a pretty slept-on champion, but the pick can do really well into a lot of the ranged top laners. That being said, though, this champion requires a lot of games on it to really master. Otherwise, you'll find that you'll end up probably suffering in a lot of games. Playing carries in the top lane always is a double-edged sword, especially in mid to low elo, because if you ever get ganked on like a really weird timer or an odd timer, it can really affect how your game can go, and it can be a lot more risky playing these kinds of champions. That being said, though, it gives you more agency on the game, and that can be a very valuable aspect of like climbing. Sion sits as a B2 option at the moment. He is my recommended go-to blind pick. Maybe not for solo queue. I think in solo queue it might differ slightly, but he's still definitely high up there. In solo queue, though, I do always just recommend blinding like your OTP or your most comfortable champion. But Sion has the ability to kind of just withstand most lanes, and then oftentimes can even look for solo kills. This champion does a deceptively large amount of early game damage. That being said, though, you don't have as much agency when you play Sion compared to other options, and that does kind of prohibit how high on the tier list I can put him. I do think he's a high beta option, though. Most of the beta picks, I think, if you pick them in the right spot, can be very good champions still. I think Fiora probably sits towards the... I think Fiora is a good champion at the moment. I think if you're very comfortable playing her, you should be able to find results. She's just, yeah, once again, harder to pilot. Not a pick I'd really recommend just taking into solo queue unless, yeah, you've sunk the games into her to really get a good understanding of the combos and the execution of the champion. Some of the ranged options include the likes of Vayne and Varus. I think these picks, again, like if you're very comfortable on them, against certain compositions can be very powerful, especially against champions which you know won't be able to consistently gank you without really being punished, or against top laners which never really have the tools to get onto you. These champions can very much thrive in those environments. Nasus, Tryndamere, I should separate these champions. In the case of Nasus, he is a great low elo split push level, like I'd say 6, 9 through 13 champion, which can be very dominant. He does scale up until like 18, and then even though he's technically an infinite scaler, doesn't really do as well really late into the game because he will struggle against the range of certain compositions, and there are tools to kite him out. But if you play around his like mid to late game, he is one of the strongest options in the game. You are just giving up a lot of agency early on, which is why you tend to want to pick him into specific matchups at the moment. The likes of Kale, he very much does dominate in that matchup, especially now that Swifties have been nerfed. That does affect certain champions within the top lane. Tryndamere is... he's an anomaly. This pick can perform really well, especially with the durability loss that certain towers have. That being said, though, the grubs being set to like one set of grubs has definitely hurts him. It hurts his ability to siege as consistently. However, that being said, though, the fact that bot lane tends to be more played for now and people tend to path away from Tryndamere does give Tryndamere freedom of access to just beat down on enemy top lane, which can be a very powerful thing for this champion to be provided with. I'd recommend picking him if you are comfortable with him and into matchups where you know you can consistently just hit towers and then permanently siege and just threaten on sides. Other than that, though, I probably wouldn't opt into the champion at the moment. Ryze got affected by the Varroa nerfs, probably sits as he's still around a mid B tier option, just a bit weaker with the loss of the 50 health and the 5 AP. Akali sits as a pretty solid B tier option. I think in the right matchups like your Gwens and your Olafs, this pick can thrive. She mostly wants to come out as a counter pick along with a lot of the B tier options, but yeah, in most spots she can definitely be a very solid champion. I think she's a great AP assassin to play in the top lane as well. Malphite, counter pick, comes in primarily as like a B4, B5, R5 option. If you can get him in the right compositions, he can be very powerful. I don't think he's in the best state he's ever been in, but yeah, pick him in the right spots against an AD matchup, which you can kind of hold in lane, and then you can kind of outvalue through the fact that you can opt into a lot of armor. It's the best way of playing this champion. You can also opt into Malignant, and with it being buffed in 25.10, it is definitely worth watching this champion. Sits within the beta, but he's also a pick which is worth watching. He's not been that performant in the solo queue for a while now. I'm kind of tempted to push him down to the C tier because this is the elo range where he just doesn't perform as well. In Elite, I still think this champion is a very solid like A tier option, but for like average play, I think he's more of a B C tier. It's probably worth watching this champion though. I'll leave him at the bottom of the B tier though at the moment. Think Ornn sits as a high B tier option in his current state. He's still the reliant on team champion, which he's always been, just not as impactful with some of the item nerfs which he has received. It's just caused him to suffer a bit. I would opt into this champion if you're not as comfortable in your ability to individually carry a game, but you're looking for a champion which can have some level of agency, because this champion does do a lot of damage. He won't consistently find kills within lane, but against people who are unsuspecting, there are angles for those kind of picks. So Ornn, definitely a pick which not as performant as he has been in the past, but is still a very high B tier option. Mundo also sits towards the high end of the B tier. He's another pick, I would say, which is worth watching for the other reason of possibly being like able to contest with most of the H options. I might bump him up next patch. This champion, obviously, he's been buffed a couple of times now, and also received the Warmorg's buffed, which massively helped him. If they were to go and buff Heartsteel, I think this champion would very much be an A tier option. It's just the case that Heartsteel is a bit weak at the moment, which kind of like marks him down slightly. Volibear, not performing that well at the moment. This pick obviously had Roa get nerfed for him this patch, which is unfortunate because he was definitely one of the champions which was opting into it before the nerfs, but is now definitely struggling a lot more. There are other Volibear build variations, and if we see people opting into maybe like the Cosmic Drive Rushes, or maybe some like tank or AD options, it'll be interesting to see what kind of comes out now. But Roa has been nerfed. Maybe he'll climb back up, but right now he definitely sits as like a lower B2 option. He's not performing as well with the nerfs towards his core item. Moving on to the A tier, then we lead off with Trundle, just a very good stat sticky split pusher, very easy to play. If you want to check out any Trundle player, I'd recommend checking out Kagaru, as he is the one of the prominent Trundle players on EU West. For Pantheon, I always recommend Spear Shot. I think Spear Shot's an incredible Pantheon. This pick is fine. I think he's a good flex option if you play him like jungle, mid, or support. I think as like a raw top lane option, he's not as great. I think he has pretty big vulnerabilities in the fact that he doesn't scale that well, and if he falls behind, he can definitely struggle within the game. But from an advantage state, and if you are good at pushing those advantages, he's still a very good champion. Renekton with his buffs is doing well. Like, this pick is definitely doing a sizable amount better with the R buffs. I was kind of memeing it originally because it was a very placebo number change, but this pick didn't really need a buff at the time. Like, he was just a jack of all trades, like B tier option champion, but the buff helps him. It was probably the right direction to buff him in, and maybe like the numbers on that on like the numbers gain on the ult was enough to like sometimes find that isolated 1v1 later on into the game, which maybe you couldn't find in the previous patch. So Renekton, sits as a pretty solid A tier champion now. Vladimir, I think, is a very slept on pick. This champion's been doing a lot better as of recent, and general nerfs to other champions once again will help him. He's good into tanks and good into matchups where he can consistently abuse them. That being said, though, tanks aren't as popular at the moment or as strong, so that can definitely hurt him. But that being said, though, I still think this champion is a very good spot. Garen sits as an A tier option. This champion got the crit nerf to his E not too long ago, and he's definitely suffered from it. He probably sits as more like a low A tier option, but if you opt into some like of the tanker options, like your Deadmans, and you can still opt into the crit, it's not like it's terrible suddenly, it is just a bit weaker, and this pick can still definitely be a very solid option. Quinn, Kennen are two of the ranged options which I recommend to just like OTP if you play them. If you don't already play them, I'd probably not recommend opting into them. That being said, though, I think they are both pretty good options in their current state. Quinn has incredible roam potential. That being said, though, Symbiotic Souls did get nerfed this patch, so there is a chance she actually does drop down towards the lower end of the A tier. I haven't looked into it too deeply, so actually be aware of that one. In the case of Kennen, though, he's a pretty hard to play champion, and you need to get those early game advantages, but if you can translate those early game advantages, he's a great AP team fighter, does a huge amount of damage, and is a deserving A tier pick in his current state. Poppy, I think, is actually a high A tier pick, but she's a counter pick. You need to play in the right spots to really get value out of her, but she definitely scales a lot better now, and the general changes to try and push her away from support towards top lane has ended up being relatively net positive for her. Camille, I still think, is a very solid A tier option. Not quite the also dominant like pick which she was before her nerfs, but sits as more like a really good counter pick option in the right matchups where she can really scale, get to like 1-2 items where you have your Trinity, your Ravenous, and maybe like a Death Stance or a Steric. Then she can be a very, very impactful champion and be a real threat on the sides against a lot of the picks within the current roster. Zax is an A2 option, a pretty niche tank, and I still think he's a very good pick, especially if you are playing him into matchups where you can consistently pick up blobs and trade HP for damage. things like tanks tend to be pretty weak into Zac because they don't have it as easy of a time bursting him out or chunking him out and denying his blobs for the most part. Teemo sits as an A2 option, great scaling, AP pick within the top lane, can have a pretty abusive laning phase if you play it correctly, does fall off quite heavily the higher up you go, but in counterpick scenarios can still definitely function, sits as like a solid middle of the pack A-tier option. Wukong, still fine within the top lane. He got nerfed not too long ago because of his jungle power, and it did affect him in the top lane, but even with those nerfs, I still think in the right spots, this champion can be a really big threat. He scales relatively well and has a very powerful ultimate, which can enable him to kind of have a core identity to play around, and he can be very abusive in certain lanes where he can just E onto them, and then just like stat check them utilizing the bonus health regen and the armor from the passive. Other picks within the A tier include the likes of Kled, who is a bit of a counterpick option at the moment, is pretty niche, kind of like your Heimerdinger as well. I think these picks are all pretty niche options, but in the right spots they can do a lot of damage and be a real big threat to certain team compositions. Heimerdinger's wave clear combined with his burst damage can be very, very powerful, and Kled with his just individualistic burst damage and his dive potential can also be a huge threat against people who just don't understand how to play against these champions. Darius isn't performing as well at the moment, and it probably drops him down towards more like a mid A to a low A tier pick. I still think this champion is an incredibly abusive laner and can be really hard to play against if you ever fall behind, but he is definitely a bit weaker with some of the direct nerfs he's received more recently. Riven, Aurelia, if you can play them, they are great options. If you can't play them, you probably want to avoid them. I think Aurelia is doing a bit worse at the moment, but Riven is still a great solo queue option, especially if you are very good at like piloting her level 6 through 9. Those are like really key points where you can really hammer home an advantage, and with Ignite being buffed, I can definitely see Riven really benefiting from that change as well. Singed, I would actually have alongside like your Heimerdinger and your Kleds and your Wukongs. It's a bit more of a niche pick, but can be very strong if you've already sunk a lot of time into him. He got buffed more recently because he got nerfed and then he got over buffed and then nerfed and then over nerfed and then buffed, and now he's kind of like sat as like a middle of the pack A tier option. In the right spots though, I think this pick is still incredibly good if you are comfortable on him. And then Aatrox sits as a high end A tier option for me at the moment. I think this pick is very close to breaking into the S tier, especially with some of the Grasp and Cinder Sky variations we've seen on him. He can opt into obviously still the Voltaic Psychosaur Lethality builds, and there are different Keystone options he can opt into depending on what matchup you play him in. I'd say he's a very solid A tier option in his current state. I'd also say towards the high end of the A tier, we have the likes of Mordekaiser and Shen. I believe the Shen buffs would be slightly smaller. I think they went a bit too hard on the buffs they gave him, considering he'd already been buffed. It'd be nice to have them like revert the other buffs, because I think the other ones they didn't feel like that impactful for Shen, but were like changes which just ended up, they were changes which just didn't need to happen. I think that's just the best way of putting them. They didn't feel like that impactful on the champion, and probably could have just shifted it towards more of an impactful buff where you'll feel more rewarded for playing this kind of a pick. That being said though, I think this champion's a great A tier pick. He is blatantly OP in matchups where his W has value, and the main issue is you just can't blind him still. I still think this pick has issues when playing into a lot of the AP pool, as his AP itemization can definitely struggle when you are forced to go things like Hollow Radiance. In the case of Mordecai, I've dropped him from the S tier to the A tier. This pick is not performant as of recent. He's still a great mid to low elo option, but probably doesn't deserve to compete with some of the S tier picks which he previously did. I've missed Jax. He sits within the B tier at the moment, like a mid to high B tier option. This pick, in the right spots, can be really good. You do need to put some time into him though, and play him primarily into auto attack based matchups. So that is where his biggest strengths lie. Moving on to the S tier then, we lead off with Yorick, who is still doing really well, especially in middle no elo. That is going to be where he performs the best. Certain matchups really struggle with the tankier ghouls as well now, so definitely tends to be more matchup dependent, but I think generalistically is still a great sieger, a great low elo, mid elo pick, which can be a great option to climb all the way to the likes of Diamond and Master. Olaf is doing really well at the moment. I think people are really sleeping on this champion. Not only is he really good in counterpick scenarios, but more generalistically, he's just doing quite well. So Olaf, definitely a pick worth watching. If you already play him, I'd recommend repicking him up and then trying him into specific matchups, trying some like itemization differences, and just seeing what works for you. I think this pick definitely looks a lot better though in its current state. I think Cho'Gath with the Symbiotic Soul Snarf is probably going to sit more like a low S tier pick now, maybe even a high A. He's still a really good tank option and scales really well, which is why he definitely performs best in like mid to low elo. But the pick is definitely going to suffer from direct nerfs to his like the build, which was kind of becoming more mainstream on the champion. The likes of Cassiopeia, I think, in the right spots, and if you play her, is incredibly good, so incredibly good, which but I believe she deserves an S tier spot. Actually, Roa got nerfed this patch. I should probably drop Cassiopeia down. Yeah, I'll leave it as a high A tier pick. I still think this pick is really good in the right spots, and you can lose that 50 health and 5 AP on item completion, and still function as a champion. I just think it might be enough to kind of drop her down slightly, as she does traditionally opt into Roa first, and yeah, that is going to be genuine power loss. Kayle and Set I would have as my next two S tier options. In the case of Kayle, she's still a great mid to low elo option. The Swifties nerfs will affect her this patch, but she scales incredibly well. She oftentimes just won't really get punished early onto the game, and the wave changes combined with buffs she received towards the end of last split, the previous split actually now, were really good for her. Set really benefited from Overlord's Blood Barrel buffs. He was already a relatively performant mid-elo champion and continues to be a performant mid-elo champion, a very deserving S-tier option. Warwick sits as a high S-tier pick. This champion still performs incredibly well in the top lane, oftentimes predicated on people just not really respecting his kit and how much damage combined with sustain he has early on to the game. That being said though, this pick does struggle a lot more the higher up you go. Primarily has to come out as a counter pick to like Ambassador to really get value in like elite play, but yeah, in mid to low elo can be a very powerful option. Still can perform quite well in high elo though. I think this champion is good in top lane, probably hidden OP in jungle, and yeah, just gives him a lot of options in terms of what you can really do with him. And then Argot probably sits more like as a mid-S option. He suffered from the Swifties nerfs this patch, definitely, and he just isn't as performant as he was before. Not quite an S+ performance champion, but still one of the premier picks, which I recommend playing. Definitely competes with the likes of Warwick, Set, and yeah, I would have him as like the number 3 here. But like things like Olaf, things like Yorick, he really struggles into, and these champions are definitely doing a lot better at the moment. So he probably drops to more like an S tier pick. My recommendations of this patch are going to be, yeah, Set, Argot, I think Warwick, if you enjoy playing the champion and you're a very, like, understanding of how to play, like, aggressive early laning phases. Kayle, if you're aware that, like, sacrificing some early agency can be, like, can give you some, like, late game power, which can be an opt-in strategy. And then Olaf, I think, as a counter pick, is one of the best champions in the game at the moment. But more generalistically, I think he's fine. So definitely worth trying some Olaf. Yorick and Cho'Gath are still great picks. And yeah, those are my thoughts. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.